Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for Hay Group's Activating the Line Insights from Leadership 2030 webinar. My name is Larissa Stefanishin, and I am part of Hay Group's team in the Philadelphia office. I'd like to let you know that today's webinar is in listen-only mode to minimize the background noise, and we encourage you to send your questions to the chat feature at the bottom left of your screen. We will be reviewing your questions at the end of the presentation. Also, please note that you can maximize your screen in the upper right-hand corner to make the slides bigger and easier to read. Today's call is scheduled for an hour. We'll spend about 45 minutes or so going through the presentation and leaving the rest of the time remaining for any questions that you may have. Lastly, please know that all attendees will receive a copy of today's presentation in the next few days. Today's presenters are Yvonne Sell and Jeffrey Blair. Yvonne helps client organizations work by assisting leaders in getting traction, implementing competency systems, and helping organizations find their talent. She is a director based in the London office and the head of the UK and Ireland's Leadership and Talent practice, and a member of the European Leadership and Talent core team. She is also a co-author of the book Leadership 2030 and presents regularly at conferences. Jeff Blair joined Hay Group almost 7 years ago after over a 15-year career in the insurance industry, having held a wide variety of management positions. Jeff is based in our headquarters here in Philadelphia. At Hay Group, he now leads our products business of the U.S. Later on during the call, we'll be joined by my colleague Liz Painter, who will join us and give us a sneak peek into the apps that we are going to discuss with you today. Now, without further ado, I'd like to pass it over to Yvonne to start us off.
Thanks, Larissa. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining. I guess it's afternoon in the U.S., morning maybe for some of you. So we're just going to spend a bit of time looking at the megatrends that we highlight in the book, as well as some of the really key implications of those for leaders in particular. And then Jeff's going to take over talking about how to activating line managers can really impact organizational performance, what HR's role in that is, and then, as Larissa mentioned, Liz will do a demo for us, and then we'll take some questions and answers. Hopefully, I'll be able to answer your questions. So this next slide really just shows some of the key things that myself and Georg, who I wrote the book with, started to notice in working with clients and just reading the newspapers and just starting to think about, in a way, why does it just feel like the world is a bit more difficult, I suppose? And started to say, how can we actually understand all these sort of data points that seem quite dispersed and maybe not linked up, and what can we do to actually try to understand what it is that's happening in the world and start to think about the implications for leaders and organizations, which is, what we at Hay Group try to do is help both of those be more effective. So we took an approach called megatrend research, which is really about saying what's already going on in the world, how can we understand them in terms of themes, and what are those ones that are likely to carry on into the future and just kind of accelerate. So megatrends are ones that have been going on for decades, so when we go through the megatrends, these aren't going to feel really new. They're going to feel like, oh yeah, I know about this. The point is they're accelerating and they're going to carry on for the next 15 years at least. That they actually affect all regions, stakeholders, so governments, individuals, businesses. So they really have great reach around the world, and they will actually fundamentally impact the way we live. So that's what we're trying to look at in terms of megatrends. They're not fashion trends. They're not, coffee trends and that. They are much bigger and broader than that. So what I'm going to do now is just go through the 6 that we identified out of a whole range that we thought were most relevant for leaders and organizations. So there's other ones going on in the world, but these are the ones that we really think we need to be paying attention to as people who work within organizations. So the first one is what we're calling Globalization 2.0. And this is really about, we're all quite familiar with Globalization 1.0, which is really about, if you will, the West moving east. So getting, cheap manufacturing in Asia, fantastic. Now, actually, there's quite an economic power shift to Asia, which can be seen in that little comic that I pulled out around the debt. But it's more than that. It's, all the Chinese companies that have bought up, say, Volvo and things like that. So there's a lot of the east moving west, if you will. And so a lot more market volatility. The impacts of what happens in one region are impacting others in terms of economies. There's more capital moving around the world. Stock exchanges buying each other and that. And along with that, there's the rise of a global middle class. And by that, we don't mean people that move around the world. That's been going around for a while. But that actually there are local middle classes in sort of every region that actually have their own tastes and their own way of doing things and are creating, in a way, their own markets. So, for example, there's a fast food joint called Jollibee in the Philippines that's actually completely beaten McDonald's in terms of local market share. So they've got about 65% of the market share, which is usually where McDonald's sits in terms of that around the world. And they've done that simply by adding pineapple to the burger and offering rice rather than fries. So there's this real thing of needing to understand those local needs of the global middle class, and that means that leaders are going to need that contextual awareness. They're going to be able to manage diversity, and whether that's east moving west or west moving east, both of those have to be going on. A lot more intercultural sensitivity, and they'll need to work on creating that personal loyalty to get to know sort of local markets and thinking about globalization. So how do you actually integrate in a much better way probably than most organizations that kind of the center versus the regions. That's going to just really accelerate. The second mega trend that we looked at was the environmental crisis. And again, I think we're seeing politicians beginning to pay a lot more attention to that around the world, particularly in the West. And it's not just about climate change, it's also about a growing scarcity of resources. So, for example, a lot of the very rare earths that are in our mobile phones, which I'm sure everyone has a phone probably sitting beside them, those are actually quite rare minerals that make those little machines function, and a lot of that is located in very remote parts of the world that are harder and harder to get at. So it costs more money to extract those minerals. And that's not just impacting us in terms of, what we can have access to. It is actually impacting the bottom line. So, for example, Coca-Cola had to close a plant in India because of a scarcity of water, of just not having enough water to drive their plant, and it created all kinds of tensions within that community. So you've got people who don't want the environmental damage versus those that might have had jobs at the factory. So you can imagine the kind of tension that creates. And so leaders really needing to be able to manage that, internal versus external tension, being able to think quite a bit around sustainability, both strategically and I think on that tactical side, because margins will be reducing as kind of many materials get more expensive. And there will have to be much more looking at collaborative solutions. So, and we'll talk about it more in technology convergence, but really people needing to work together to figure out what the right answer is. And it could be just a huge issue for organizations. The third megatrend is about individualization, and I kind of think of this as the Starbucks trend, at least the coffee trend. So, when I was growing up, you went in, you got a coffee, and you got it either with milk and sugar, or just milk, or just black. There was sort of three choices, which is you can see in those slides. And now, of course, it's the double shot, no fat milk with cinnamon sprinkles latte that people order. So far more complex, that it is about these micro markets where kind of everyone wants things exactly how they want them. And it's also going global, as we've seen with the Arab Spring in the last few years, in part what's going on in the Ukraine, so that it's going on all over the world. And that means that really the creatives will start to have more power, because if we need to design things for micro markets and need to figure out ways to deliver quite individualized experiences to customers and employees, we need to be creative about how to do that. And as well, there's what we're calling values pluralism. So if you think prior to a lot of the technology that's available, most of our values came from within our own geography, within the people that we interacted with. Now it's actually relatively easy to go and connect with people in very small groups and have your values influenced by a much wider range of media and ideas than there was before. And that means there's just a huge pressure in terms of loyalty to organizations and loyalty to leaders and indeed loyalty to countries. But we're more specifically concerned with organizations and leaders. So it's about saying, what does loyalty mean? What does retention mean if you're thinking about it from an HR standpoint? So maybe people do need to come and go within organizations, and how do we actually expand our network to think about these are resources that we might pull into. They're not necessarily employees, but maybe we need to rethink how all of that works, and how do you really redefine what retention and loyalty mean in that context, and how do you get that organizational loyalty that means people will come back to you when they've gone away and done whatever it is they need to do to get that experience. The fourth megatrend, which really underlies a lot of why individualization has happened, is digital lifestyle and work. And this is, funny enough, when we first started doing this research, I used to ask people, who has a mobile phone or a smartphone, this was only 3-4 years ago, and now I actually ask who only has one device, and find that in many of the audiences that I'm talking to, there are actually only about between 25 and 30% of people that only have one device on them, whereas most people are carrying, a tablet and a phone, or they've got a personal phone and a work phone, or they've got a Kindle and a work phone, or, whatever it is. So we're really using the digital media more and more for everything, and doing that actually really blurs the boundary between public and private, and between work and life. And it means, we can kind of work wherever, whenever we want. That means we've got to redefine sort of what the workplace is. It also means there's some differences in terms of our relationships. We have, all the research suggests we're having far few strong connections and a lot more loose connections. It also means that there's greater and greater access to information. If we think Snowden and WikiLeaks and all these sorts of things, it just is easier and easier for people to get access to that information. So actually transparency and openness just become far more critical. So the demands on leaders in terms of this are just tremendous. So there's great differences in terms of how different generations view the media and how they use them and how comfortable they are with them. There's a lot around how do we actually lead remotely. I think that's going to be one of the most common questions I hear my clients asking me. How do I lead a remote team? This pressure, as I've said, on openness and really figuring out how do you help people adapt to this technology that is constantly changing, and how do you, in some ways, not just look after getting them to work, but how do you actually help them switch off so that they can remain effective in their role? So this is having just a tremendous impact on us. I'm sure you've all experienced it. And what's also happening is that there's a huge demographic shift. So the world population is growing and aging, but there's imbalances in different places in the world. So Western developed nations tend to have greater aging populations. So, for example, in Japan, there are actually more diapers sold for adults than there are for babies, which kind of every time I think about that, I just think, wow. I think that kind of says that demographic shift just in a nutshell, which creates huge pressures on social systems, huge pressures on all the pension plans, which are crippling a lot of organizations. It means there's going to be a lot of demand again on that war for talent. And it also means that we're going to need to attract and bring in people from nations where there isn't that huge demographic shift. It also means that this intergenerational working will become greater. So, and a lot of people are choosing, because we're staying healthier, much older. People don't necessarily want to retire at 65 if they're going to be living to 105. That may or may not be appealing. Not to mention the economic crisis destroyed a lot of people's pensions. So there's are the needs in terms of performance management systems or even reward systems actually the same for someone who's in their 70s as they are for someone in their 20s starting their career? And how are we going to design systems that actually take care of that? And how are leaders going to actually manage to keep motivating those people? Because they're going to have much greater diversity in terms of their needs. and that's just going to create, again, a huge demand on leaders in terms of the complexity that they're dealing with. And then lastly, the last trend is around technology convergence. So this isn't just about technology, so it's not just about digital, it's about how these things are converging. So for example, I heard of a surgeon who has actually worked with an IT professional to speed up the amount of time that babies need to spend in an MRI. He's a heart surgeon for infants. And he's then used the data that he gets from the MRI to feed it into a 3D printer and print out a model of the baby's heart so he can actually practice the surgery on it before he goes in to do the actual surgery. It's that kind of convergence that we're talking about, the development of LJ lamps and things like that. And the big demand about that is it's almost because we can't in some ways predict what's going to be invented because there's just some amazing things going on, cyborgs and fridges that communicate with grocery stores and all sorts of stuff. So it's not about necessarily predicting what actually is going to come down the pipe in terms of technology, but it's the fact that for organizations, if they really want to be in the game, they've absolutely got to get in on what we're calling big collaboration, and that might mean that your competitors are your collaborators in some areas in terms of developing new technology, that you're working with completely different types of organizations. So if you put together pharmaceuticals and IT is trying to develop new ideas and do fixes to their technology hourly, maybe monthly, whereas pharma's used to thinking around timelines of 10, 12 years. If you're a leader trying to put those two groups of people together to create a project, how do you manage that incredible difference in terms of how they view the timelines? So it'll be that'll be really key. And then there's a whole piece around that difference between what we can do and what we should do in terms of how do we actually help regulators understand the technology? How do we help CEOs and CFOs understand this technology that they maybe can't actually understand the technical details of because it's so complicated, as well as the anxiety within the general populace. How do you get ideas accepted and what's going to be allowed and what's not? So those are the 6 megatrends. We think they really combine to create some clear implications for organizations and kind of reinforce each other. So these are the 5 reinforcers. So stakeholder proliferation. So we can consider the environment, for example, as a stakeholder now. There's more and more pressure groups. It's not just about shareholders. There's a whole variety of concerns that leaders will need to take into account. In part because of that, and also because of digital working and Gen Y and those things, there's a bit of a power shift. So leaders will actually have less power, less ability to make decisions, just directly, and not to mention the complexity. And that's going to lead to some new working practices around, how decisions are made, big collaboration, how much hierarchy do you want. All those things will need to be taken into account to figure out new ways of working. And organizations will also need to figure out how to deal with the cost explosion, again, because of all the megatrends. And also how do we make sure we're really having ethical businesses and that increasing ethicization, lovely word, of businesses. We think that those are all really reinforced by all 6 megatrends. And then there's some things where they seem actually a little bit in conflict with each other. So as we're increasingly global, but if we take into account the environmental crisis, how much travel is the right amount of travel? Obviously, if we're trying to manage remote teams, it's helpful to meet people face to face. How do we actually use technology well to make sure that we communicate across boundaries, but when do we actually need to get on a plane? What's the implications of that? How do you manage that? How do we actually have enough resources for this growing middle class that's happening around the world? Our demands for technology are increasing, and yet, as I was saying, the minerals that we need to drive those are decreasing and in remote places. How's that going to play out? We don't know. The increasing complexity of organizations, the need for big collaboration, the globalness, the micro markets all suggest that actually we're going to need more and more complex organizations and more complex structures. but at the same time, that drive around the power shift, and that means that actually we probably want flatter organizations. So how are we going to actually end up kind of designing the right types of organizations that are really fit for purpose? And I think every organization will find its own way through. I don't think there's one simple answer. And then there's a piece around time horizon. So increasingly, the digital age is speeding up our demand for getting an answer right away. You don't know something, you just Google it and find out. We don't sit there and have a discussion and think it through. We just try to find the answer. And at the same time, we're facing some incredibly complex problems, and we need to take that time and think about how far in the future we can do it. And we're also raising generations of people that maybe are not used to being able to sit and think. So those are kind of the dilemmas. How are they going to play out? We're not really sure. But what we are sure of is that the sort of alpha male heroic leadership piece is really over. There can't be a simple kind of command and control type of leadership anymore. It's got to be far more collaborative, far more what we're calling altrocentric. So this is really about thinking of the other first rather than thinking of yourself first. And if some of you are familiar with Cantor's work, she's talked about zooming in and zooming out in terms of from strategy to detail. We also think there's a shift of being able to, right now a lot of leaders zoom in on task and they zoom out on the person. Increasingly, you're going to zoom in on the person and zoom out on task. Have a lot more trust in that individual to deliver and do what it is they need to do. And so what we did was think about, well, what are really the things that an altrocentric, this leader of the future, is going to be able to need to do. And we've created a bit of an ideal type, if you will, of the competencies of the altrocentric leader that you'll see. And it's really about being quite comfortable in their own skin in terms of those inner strengths. Obviously, being able to be empathetic. They're going to need to have very strong values around ethical standards and caring about diversity, being intellectually curious about people as well. They'll need some pretty big brains, so being able to have that contextual awareness and actually being able to figure out who the stakeholders are will be a competency in and of itself. And they'll need to make sure that once they've identified those stakeholders, they can really interact with them in a meaningful way. And that means creating meaning within their organization. So the sort of burning platform speech around what is this organization here to deliver, as well as being able to really work across boundaries in terms of that big collaboration. And then to get things done, they'll really need to work with their team and as well create what we're calling bounded autonomy, which is that piece I was talking about around being able to say, this is where we're headed to. Here's where you're allowed to make decisions and here's where you're not. Here's the sandbox you can play in. And that they'll need to be quite good at being able to do that, and they'll need organizational systems to really support them. So that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour of the concepts and that behind the book, and sort of our take on where we're headed and what we think leaders will need to deliver that in the future. And so now I'm going to hand it over to Jeff to talk about implications.
Thank you, Yvonne. Yvonne really paints a challenging picture for us, and I do recommend to everybody to read Yvonne and Georg's book, Leadership 2030. I strongly suggest you read it to the end because it provides a lot of information about these megatrends, and the challenges start to build up, and it's quite a relief when you get to the end and the authors really start to point out some ways that we can move forward and be effective in this very complex world that we're in, and it's going to increase in complexity going forward. So, being a good manager was never easy, but looking forward, it could become impossible unless we change. And the questions we need to be asking ourselves is, how can we develop managers' capabilities to be successful in this complex world we see coming? And how can we arm managers with the information and technology they need to get the job done in this increasingly complex world? This is a great opportunity for human resources to be strategic and to take the lead and empower managers so they can be successful. But it's not just about managers. HR is facing significant challenges on its own. Study after study, conversation after conversation we have with clients tell us CEOs are asking or demanding, depending on the CEO, that HR becomes a strategic business partner. But, a lot of the conversations move to, but what does that mean? How do you become a strategic business partner? How does HR become one? Where is the time to act strategically? And at the same time that the CEO is asking HR to be strategic, HR is telling us they struggle to get people in their organizations to follow policy. Managers don't know the policies, they don't understand the policies, they may choose to ignore the policies, or managers are creating their own policies based on a Google search. So, as you will see, overall, managers don't think they are getting what they need to be successful. I think now would be a good time. We can take a quick poll for the folks on the line. Interested in people's views on finding the time to be strategic. So how much time do you spend on dealing with day-to-day questions from managers? And we'll give folks a moment to put in their answers. Okay, the answers are coming in. Just give us one more second. Well, you might not be surprised that there's quite a few folks that are spending a third of their time or more on day-to-day questions. And it's tough to be strategic when you spend that much of your time dealing with the day-to-day details and supporting managers. One of the struggles for HR and a key accountability is making sure people policies get properly implemented. And failure to do so will impact the organization or the ability of the organization to successfully implement strategy. Organizations define their strategy and translate them into people policies, and this is a key role for human resources, and then the expectation is managers implement these policies. Clearly, spending more time hand-holding and policing policies is not an option given the amount of time human resources are already spending, but we're still seeing this breakdown. And managers not feel like they own people policies or in some cases even understand them. This lack of clear ownership or understanding leads to breaks in policy that can be costly. This could result in increased turnover and reduced effectiveness of the people in the organization. So HR is being being challenged by CEOs to be more strategic, and probably failing because they're working so hard and spending so much time trying to help line managers implement policies which are best for the company, the manager, and the employees. And you would think line managers must really appreciate all this selfless effort by HR to make them successful in this policy. Well, if we take a look at some of the feedback we're getting from managers on how they feel, nearly half the managers that we surveyed feel that HR actively blocks them from making decisions. That managers feel disempowered, find that their HR teams are slow to respond to requests, and there's that Google again, is a better source for information and support than HR. And nearly 2/3 of managers feel that HR closely guard information and data. And again, if you think about the data transparency, that is particularly an issue that bothers people going forward. So now we're disappointing our CEOs with not being more strategic, and we still have unhappy and ineffective managers. But not only that, it's also a retention issue. Now more than ever, good managers are going to be hard to find. And a big piece of this is a demographic issue that Yvonne touched upon. By 2020, the over 65s will outnumber the under 50s globally for the first time ever. And, this aging workforce is going to exacerbate an issue of a reduced pool of potential managers. Interestingly enough, a much lower percentage of the Gen Y generation want to be managers than previous generations. And again, it makes sense with the research that you see in Leadership 2030 regarding the individualization, the mobility that people want, but essentially, a lower percentage of this group is going to want to move into management than from previous generations, Generation X and baby boomers before them. So now you have a smaller pool to work with, and also, this is a group that is going to be highly mobile and more likely to switch organizations. So, in the U.S., for example, or by the year 2025, 3 out of every 4 workers globally will be Gen Y. So we have a group that will be more mobile and less interested in management, and we have to focus on retention to keep these managers. Now and in the future, retention of good managers will be a greater competitive advantage than it ever was in the past. Now, if we stop for a second and think about the megatrends and their implications Yvonne spoke of, and the people challenges this creates, it can feel daunting, and it is. The challenge is to activate your managers, to make them effective and successful and able to deliver on your strategy. This is a fantastic opportunity for HR to act strategically. HR can advance the organization by putting technology right in the hands of line managers, facilitating lightning-fast decision made in line with policy while creating an environment of open sharing of information and ownership of personal development. And technology, advances in technology and the use of technology is inherent in a number of the megatrends and the things that are driving these changes in our workplace and our society, but can also be part of the solution, especially as we have this growing population of digital natives. A line I like that came from someone at Cisco was, there's 206 bones in the human body, and the smartphone could plausibly be considered the 207th. In an article in Mobile in the Future from Forbes, people are using mobile devices to do everything they do, and there's something they can't do on their mobile phones. They're frustrated and ready to leap to the first offering that comes along. So technology, the mobile phone is now attached, and it's how people want to do work. And as we said in our Leadership 2030, we now operate in a digital 24/7 workplace driven by the explosion of online, social, and mobile technologies. Managers are always on and expect information and knowledge at their fingertips. I mentioned earlier when we're talking about activating our managers how policy breaks down when implementing strategy. So Hay Group has created a suite of business apps that helps you implement your strategy by putting the right information directly into the hands of the people who make it happen, your managers. Policy gets very sticky, and people can follow policy when you activate your line managers so they can understand and own the policies. It stops being an HR thing. When you activate your managers, it enables managers to make people decisions in line with strategy in real time, and more easily and more quickly undertake people processes so that managers can get back to or get back on the job of managing. Not only do managers want answers right away, their direct reports expect answers even faster than that. So the managers are in a tough position. Another area where Activate really connects with the changing demographics of the workplace is we can improve managers, their own capability on managing and leading their teams. The Gen Y demographic expects constant development. Activate puts the tools in their hands and allows them to take personal ownership of their development. There are decades and decades of experience and expertise in the HR space. Like any discipline, we have our own language, and we can't expect HR neophytes to become experts overnight, even if they wanted to become experts. We want to keep the expertise, but make it understandable and accessible to managers and to a wider audience when, where, and how they needed to do their jobs. We've put ourselves in the manager's shoes and created these applications that are mobile and available to managers whenever they want and need. It's simple, it's HR speak, and it's set up in the way that a manager thinks. But we also don't want to abandon the same people policies that we've been working so hard to make stick. Activate is not about letting managers run amok with information and HR tools. Rather, HR is always in the driver's seat. We've created configurable apps that allow HR to set up, input their policies, and determine the level of information that gets shared with managers and what managers can share back with HR. So I've talked about the apps in theory. We've launched our first 3 apps. Our next round of apps are already in production and will be launched in the coming months. So this is just the beginning of our journey. The first app at a high level, our Leadership Styles and Climate app, is built on the premise that changing behavior is about developing new habits, and developing new habits take time. The app builds a bespoke plan of doable daily tasks and employs gamification techniques to help managers stick to it for the length of the plan. The app also employs some elements of crowdsourcing that is so prevalent and popular in today's social media. It's like a coach in the pocket and supports managers at every stage of their development. We've also created a job grading and job pricing app, and they're built on the premise that managers need to be working with the same information and the same methods within the same policies as their HR partners, so consistent people decisions can be made correctly and quickly. This will significantly reduce and eventually eliminate the classic wasting, never get those hours back HR line manager dance to get to a decision we've all experienced. Managers already have access to data and information via various places on the web. By giving your line managers access to your organization's information and policies, everybody can be working from the same playbook. So I've teased this long enough. I'd like to turn this over to my colleague Liz Painter, who can show you at a high level our first 3 apps.
Perfect. Thanks, Jeff. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take a very quick look into the apps themselves. We're just going to go over it for the next 5 minutes and then open up for questions, but we look forward to sending you all an invitation to take a deeper dive into the apps themselves. So if you don't already have your screen on full screen, it would definitely help here so that you can see everything in a bit more detail. But on this first tab, you can see what an individual will see once they log into the app. Now, across the top are the 3 apps that Jeff mentioned. So it's the pricing, the grading, and the styles and climate app. At the bottom, you can see a couple of additional things. My plan goes hand in hand with styles and climate, and I'm just going to jump right into my people. So as you can see here, the line manager has the ability to see all of their direct reports here, and they can filter or sort by multiple items. Now, just for this example, let's say I'm a line manager. Here are all of my direct reports, and I have the ability to see information specific to them that's been either preloaded or added over time. So I'll just select on one. In this particular case, we can see this person's location as well as their grade. We can see their title and their details. Then at the bottom, there is a link in order to grade the job or price a job. So, just as an anecdote, let's suppose, and this happens quite frequently, a line manager is really trying to understand where this position will be moving in the next year or so, wants to understand what is going to make that job bigger and what the new pay package might look like. So we'll select grade a job. On the next tab, you can see this is where the individual actually goes through the grading process. Now, for each individual job, there are elements that make a position larger or smaller. And so for a particular sales rep, you can see those items include targets, types of sales, complexity of portfolios, etc. So once that's complete, what we'll provide now is the new grade. So in this particular case, this position is actually increased based on some of the adjustments made to the future job. And we can see here some of the adjustments that have been made and the new grade. Now, if we scroll to the bottom, it will immediately take us to a link you can see to actually price this position. All of this information can be shared with HR so that they are a vital part of that whole conversation and so that line managers and HR are speaking a very common language rather than feeling that HR is guarding the information. So that can be shared, and then once selected, we can actually price the job. So I'm just going to show you what you'll see when you price the position. So for this particular example, we can see that we can actually get market data for multiple countries. In this particular case, let's just say that Carlos was moving over to our China operation. Now, all of what you're seeing here is configurable to Jeff's point. So HR really is in control to do a couple of things. Everything from controlling the percentiles of the market data that is being shown, as well as really pushing down their company policy data or what the policy pay range or structure is at that particular grade. Again, everything's configurable, so they could just show the company policy information if they preferred. The idea here is it really starts a vital dialogue of the process and includes line managers in the process that they're really experiencing on a daily basis. On the next tab, the individual line manager can also get a visual breakdown of the package itself and understand what the total package looks like. So that is a very brief sneak peek into pricing and grading. I'm going to walk you briefly through styles and climate as well. So let's say I click here on the Styles and Climate app. It takes us into our Styles and Climate piece. Now, we've all been there. We've gone through a program where we feel pretty energized walking out. We want to make different changes. This actually allows it to happen rather than having to keep track on something, perhaps on pen and paper. And it's incredibly interactive and makes it fun. So once an individual leader has gone through our assessments, our leadership styles and climate assessment, they will be able to import all of their data into the system by scanning the QR code or entering manually. Once they've done so, they will get a summary of their results, so where they're at in terms of range of styles as well as their climate. Now, an individual would have received this feedback, so this will not be new to them. Once they understand where they're at, they'll have the ability to come in here and start designing their plan. As you can see here, we focus on different areas over time, and each lasts about 4 to 6 weeks. So let's just say as a line manager, we come in here and we start focusing on clarity. What we'll do is we'll actually go through the process of selecting what we call micro tips, and they are indeed just that. They're very small tips that can be embedded into every day so that individual leaders can actually start having conversations and creating behaviors based on those micro tips from Hay Group or from the experts internally. And again, to Jeff's point, this is where crowdsourcing really comes to play. You can see here are some star ratings where tips from other individuals within the organization or in other organizations can actually start sharing that, something that a lot of folks have come to expect as part of social media. So once we've selected our micro tips, what will happen is they will automatically be scheduled with our direct report. So you can see here it has been scheduled, and the individual leader will just go through selecting once they've completed different activities. Now, once they start selecting different items, we'll just click next here, they will be able to start gaining points, and this is where gamification comes into play. And what we mean by that is that as individuals continue to go through different activities, they will gain points. And then once they have completed a particular area of their overall roadmap or plan, they will be able to see how their actual direct reports have interpreted all of this and if there's been some changes through very small micro surveys where they will gain achievements. Now, what's significant about this is that, as you can see here on this tab, they will actually be able to see how they're doing compared to the rest of their peer group. In this particular example, it's the rest of the sales team. And this individual will be able to see not only from a purely points perspective and achievements, but also how they really stack up across the board. and this is just a preview of gaining points. So now that you've seen the 3 apps, I'm going to turn it over to the main team, but we look forward to definitely showing you a live version in a bit more detail.
Thank you, Liz, for going through that and giving us a sneak peek into the apps and how they look and what they do and all that. I also want to take a second and just thank Yvonne and Jeff for going through the presentation and sharing all their information as well. Now, before we get to the questions that you have, just a reminder also, if you do have questions, feel free to submit them through the chat. And I just see that a question did come in. The presentation will be available. We'll send this to everyone afterwards so you have a copy of the deck. But before we get to any other further questions you have, just a question we have for you. If you could select which topics or products you would like more information on. You can select more than one, and I'll just give everyone a second or two to pick that. Just going to give everyone another second just to make a selection and submit your results. All right, thank you everyone for your responses. I just want to remind everyone once again that today's webinar was recorded and will be posted to our website. All attendees will receive a copy of the slide deck that was presented today. For anyone that is interested in a one-on-one demonstration of our apps, we would be happy to set that up with you. But please note that we also have a group webinar demo scheduled for next month, so you can expect an invitation for that in the upcoming days. Now I'll begin to review some of the questions that came in through the chat. So one question I see that just came through asks, is there one megatrend that you feel leaders, managers are least prepared for right now, and what can we do about it?
That's a good question. I think it does vary a little bit by industry, but I actually think in many ways it's the environmental crisis that most people, it's an unpleasant thing to really think about, and I think even though people are aware of it and it gets a lot of media press, we haven't thought through how it impacts organizations. So like the example I gave around Coca-Cola and that, I think organizations and leaders haven't really started to say, oh, how is this actually going to impact me and my organization, and where we do business and how we do business, and questions of how that impacts my retention and attraction of staff and all that sort of stuff. So I think it's probably the one that people haven't quite made the link to the bottom line in organizations and leadership implications as much as maybe some of the others.
Okay, great. Thanks, Yvonne. Another question that came through asks, if I wanted to start developing altrocentric leaders in my organization, where do I start?
Again, a really good question, and I think it's a bit of a, as they'd say here in the UK, how long is a piece of string kind of question. So I think in parts it depends on where you're at, but I think one of the biggest things is around self-awareness, and in fact, interestingly, I actually just did an assessment yesterday where this fellow, kind of everything was kind of all about him. Great guy, but just really focused on himself. And I think building self-awareness to even just help hold the mirror up for people to say, actually you need to be thinking about others. You need to be thinking about how you help others deal with the complexity in the environment. It's probably one of the key starting points for any sort of developmental journey for individuals. I also think there's a piece around actually just getting a bit of a baseline measurement about where your leadership is right now, to have a sense of which levers you might need to pull to help move the organization forward.
Okay, great. Thank you. Another question that came in, this one's probably for you, Jeff, if you could answer this one. Have you seen any unintended consequences of giving line managers direct access to HR information?
No, it's a good question. I think the quick answer is we've seen lots of intended consequences. And it's interesting because one of the discussions that we have with clients is for many companies, they don't share that type of information. So there's a lack of transparency. And you need to start to dig in and say, well, what is it? There must have been reasons why we did that, or maybe not, or maybe when those decisions were made, they were made a long time ago. And what's the advantage of sharing information? And what we have found is, one, there are companies out there that have always published, grades and salary structures for managers. So there was some information out there, and that's created the space for more collaborative work with line managers and HR. And the Activate approach that we're talking about takes it even a step further and breaks down any more silos and guarding of information. And really the idea is, transparency is a great disinfectant and gets everybody on the same page, working with the same data. And one of the things when I talk to clients about is, especially when we're talking about pay data, I just say, look, let's all be honest. Everybody in your organization has access to some sort of pay data. It doesn't take much looking to get it, but then there's a real issue that it's not the same data you're working with, and in the same way that your expertise is brought to it. So we're not seeing sort of unintended consequences from that standpoint.
All right, thank you. We're just going to take one more question, just being conscious of time. And if you do think of any additional questions, feel free to contact either of our presenters, whose contact information is listed on the slide right now in front of you. So one more question we have asks, are you planning to develop any other personal development apps?
Well, the short answer is yes, absolutely. And one of the next round of apps will be right in line with personal development. We do see this as a key challenge for companies in managing and developing their people. And, we're very excited about the first app that we developed in helping managers work on improving their leadership and improving the climate they create for their employees. But this is just the first one. We're looking at the various points in an employee's life cycle and working in an organization, and how we can help them develop and best work in this new and complex working environment. So yes, a lot more to come, and I think we can all expect the next entry in this category in the next couple of months.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you to both Jeff and Yvonne for going through those questions that came in. Appreciate it. So everyone, that concludes today's webinar. I just want to thank you all for listening. And as I mentioned before, we are scheduled to have a group webinar demonstration next month, so you can have even a further look into the apps and get a full demonstration. And an invitation for that will be sent out in the upcoming days. If you wish to reach out directly to our presenters, feel free. Their contact information is listed on the slide. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and have a great rest of the day. Information is listed on the slide. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and have a great rest of the day. Information is listed on the slide. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and have a great rest of the day. Information is listed on the slide. Thank you, everyone, for